Oh, but she was like terminally ill. Does that do it for you, Alan?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
I was being Alan. He likes to pause.
Well, that's perfect, because this week our discussion is on adolescence, and what is more awkward, aside from adolescence, than pauses, awkward pauses make people feel like they're doing something wrong.
I love awkward pauses. I try to feel them as deeply as possible.
Oh, why do you do that?
Because someone has to. You can't just let all the awkward pauses disappear in the world. Someone has to collect them and put them in a bottle.
Nobody has to enjoy them. That's not mandated or necessary.
Before we get too much into our adolescence discussion, after our discussion, we will be doing our very first top three, and we'll be doing top three adolescent characters in TV, movies, books, anywhere there's fiction available. And I just want to take a quick opportunity and thank everyone. I don't know if you saw on Facebook, but we have officially reached over 10,000 downloads for the show in 8 months, which is, in my opinion, pretty amazing. So thank you so much, all of our listeners, for supporting the show and listening on a regular basis. We love hearing from you, and we really appreciate your support for the show.
Are you saying people have listened to us gab 10,000 times?
Essentially, yeah.
That is absolutely incredible. Well, it's hard for us to shut up, but thanks for listening, everyone.
I did see that post on Facebook with the image of the 10,000 views. At first, I thought it was like a bat breaking, but then I realized it was a champagne bottle. So,
I thought it was a bat too.
I thought you thought it was a bat too.
We knocked it out of the park. That's what happened.
So it's not even a bat; it's a champagne bottle.
All right. So,
adolescence is the topic.
Yes.
Okay, wait. So what's the very first thing you guys think of? Word association, go. What's the very first thing you think of with adolescence? Because I have one.
I'm going to give the whole show away if I say it.
What? No, just what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Just the first image, the first word, the first...
I'm not joking. Because I've read books on this and went through classes, the first thing that comes to my mind is abandonment. And I know that's really sad.
Okay, let's shift it. Let's reframe the question before we get into that. Let's try. When you think of your personal adolescent experience, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
I think mine's still the same. I just think of that little smiling poop emoji.
Are you serious?
Yeah, that totally sums it up for me. Completely.
For me, it's this awkward family photo where I have like a lion on my shirt or something, and I'm trying to stand, but I don't know quite how to stand because my arms are super long. Just being uncomfortable. I think being uncomfortable in my own skin. That's adolescence.
Yeah, the picture I get is my sophomore high school picture for that year, and it is just not good.
Now Jeff's got to share it.
Nope, that's not going to happen. All right, so I think for adolescence, our common denominator for all of us is probably the context of youth group, wouldn't you say?
Sort of.
Yeah. Well, unless you're like me and you have a second adolescence in your late 20s.
Well, adolescence is so, it's been changing. We've all heard that. Adolescence itself has been changing, and part of adolescence is having multiple selves, like not quite knowing who you are, and you have your youth group self and your family self, your high school self, all that kind of stuff. So I think for me, adolescence was just like super fragmented. Yeah.
What is it? Because I feel like the experience of adolescence, like existential crisis, not knowing your identity, managing multiple identities, like habits that are childlike or whatever. For example, I remember when even to this day, when I go back home to visit my folks, I experience what is comically called revertigo. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? When you get into these environments?
No. Explain revertigo.
Revertigo. It's like when you get into an environment that you used to be in as a kid, you kind of lapse back into these weird old behaviors, and people around you treat you like a way former version of yourself because they don't really know your current self anymore. So does that mean you're like returning to adolescence, or you're just like performing adolescence? And if so, what is adolescence if you can perform it as an adult, Well,
I think part of the problem is that adolescence in the context of history is a pretty new development. I mean, it's a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, where families moved from farms, and now we had factories and people working, and now there's this kind of middle ground between with child labor laws, like when does a child become an adult and how do we maneuver through all that when it comes to labor was the catalyst for moving the idea of adolescence forward. And it really started out as a primarily American thing that has kind of moved forward as more industry has kind of covered the globe in certain areas. So it's
part of the reason for that happening, right, is everything's become individualized. When you had your family unit, was everybody had to work on the farm, everyone had to be together. Adolescence wasn't as such a big deal. But now that we're so individualized and all our jobs are individualized and our communities are fractured by that industry, that's created this adolescence, right?
Exactly.
That's the byproduct.
And the reason we can't pinpoint it is because it's ever changing just as much, because it's so connected to the way our economy and our culture work, that as that changes, adolescence is going to change. And for the most part, the biggest change in adolescence since the beginning is that it's been prolonged. So some people are saying that adolescence, for the most part, is seeping into the mid to late 20s. And it's not a second adolescence, it's just still adolescence for a lot of people. And that has to do primarily, no offense, Mona, but it has primarily to do with, a lot of it has to do with the economy. So when students are going to college and because the economy and there's not a job, even though they have a degree, they go back home and there's kind of just this lingering that tends to happen.
Lingering is a good word for it. I would say lurking is maybe a better word.
Yeah.
and one thing that I think that needs to be pointed out that Jeff's saying is, you said culture is changing, so it's hard to pin down because that necessarily means adolescence is changing. And there's a psychologist named John Santrock who said adolescence begins in biology. There are very good biological reasons for what adolescence is and why it's different than childhood and different than adulthood, but it ends in culture. Adolescence begins in biology, ends in culture. So when culture changes, it necessarily changes adolescence. But one thing that bothers me so much is that people always say, like, I don't know, they say bad things about teenagers and adolescents, and our culture is in the mode of shaming people who are not, pulling their weight or doing this or that. But they forget that there are significant things happening in biology, in adolescent minds and brains that they can't see. I read somewhere that the gray matter in the minds of kids is not forming at the rate that it used to. So it's the prolonged adolescence is not just something that's cultural. It's also something biological. Your brain has not fully formed or developed. So when we expect these kids to be responsible and have self-identity and all this other stuff, you're failing to see what's happening inside of their brain itself.
But I was going to say, but is that environmentally determined? Is that determined by, who's to say that that's fully just determined genetically or biologically? But like, maybe because we don't have expectations placed on teens, we tell them, you guys are just a bunch of deviants and you can't handle abstract thinking because your brain is developing a certain way. Maybe that causes their brain to develop a certain way. Like the causality in that is really fuzzy for me.
It's a feedback thing for sure.
But
Culture
that's only,
does affect
it's
biology.
only a recent feedback loop in the sense of when you tell their brain is developing, because honestly, up until even within brain science, up until the late 90s, early 2000s, it was generally assumed that the brain stopped developing before adolescence, that it was finished developing. And it's only been fairly recently, within the last decade or so, where we've had a ton of information to show that the adolescent brain is still developing. One of the common, like Alan was talking about, the common things that we insult teenagers for is the idea that they're irresponsible. They forget this or they forget that. And we're learning now that a lot of that has to do with this stage of brain development, just like the stage of a toddler is repetition. It's part of how they're interacting with the world, and it's not a responsibility thing. Which when that changed the way I looked at youth ministry when I was a youth pastor, is that we really need to relook at how we do this kind of thing and stop expecting them to be adults and realize that this is an important stage that can't be mirrored in the way we do church as a whole.
Yeah, and I've heard different arguments. Like, it's on one hand good to have high expectations for adolescents because they can rise to them. Sure. And I think you need to do that with a safety net and amount of grace. Like, they're going to probably let you down, but if you don't expect anything of people, they tend to sink to the lowest common denominator, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, and if you don't give people an adolescent period, if they don't have a healthy adolescence, like I would say I had like an overlearned sense of responsibility in adolescence, and I didn't act like an adolescence. I didn't allow myself to explore in adolescent times, and I I kind of had to do that much later to develop fully as a subject, I felt, and so there's that toss up of like, do people really need adolescence? Does everybody need an adolescence?
Well, okay, so it's easy for us to go back to a time when adolescence didn't exist and say people just became adults so much quicker. Adolescence was 16 to 18 years old and boom, you're done. Now it's like 12 years old and sometimes even earlier, up to like 25, 6, 7. But the world that adolescents are living into these days is so radically different than any world that has ever existed before in human history. So to say that it's going to be like the same thing or it has to look the same way as some past moment is missing the point. And yes, I do think that responsibility is a part of adolescence. I think everybody agrees on that. I really like what you said, Mona, about the safety net. We do need to give adolescents enough responsibility for them to develop their sense of self and autonomy. But that safety net is the sense that even when they mess up, the adult community and the community around them is still going to care for them. You know what I mean? Is still going to be there to nurture them even when they don't live up to the adult community standards. I think it's like a good definition of how to not abandon adolescence.
Yeah, and I think what happens a lot of times is we take all of the like unruly behaviors that are kind of looked down on for adult society to function, and we like dump them into the category of adolescence. And I seem to remember in particular being continually frustrated as a teen that I wasn't taken seriously and I wasn't really listened to because I thought I had decent ideas and I felt like I was constantly being pat on the head. So I think it can be problematic to just assume that teens are just going to let you down, because there's a lot of teens who really want to be taken seriously out there,
Yeah, and even the ones that look like they're failing. I feel like I should say this over and over and over. Adolescents who look like they're failing according to adult standards or society standards, they're actually super resilient, and they're actually really powerful people, human beings, because they have been put in a situation where they have to learn how to survive. I know, like, on the outside, adolescents look indifferent or like they don't care or apathetic. But if you understood what's happening in adolescence today, you'd realize that like there's abandonment at all levels. The pressure to perform and to appear a certain way at school is so heavy, and with their friends. But the caring is so shallow when it comes to adults and even their own peer group. They've learned how to survive, and so they're incredibly resilient people. And to sell them short, like we always do, is a travesty. I agree.
Well, yeah, taking risks is a really healthy thing. Like, you have to learn how to take risks.
And most of the time, we don't realize that we're participating in that. Like, one of the informative books for me as a youth pastor was a book by Chap Clark called Hurt.
Yes, that's where most of my information comes from, too.
And then a second one called Tribe Apart, which was done outside of the Christian context, which was also very, very good. But I mean, the basic premise of both of these books is that here's this stage of life where someone is trying to figure out who they are and what they're going to become, and everything that's supposed to be for them, school, sports, even youth group, is not really for them. So it causes them to retreat into their own subcultures and rarely really let anyone in. So it's easy to misrepresent or stereotype teenagers and not really understand what's going on because everything you think you have for them. Like, for instance, like sports. When was the last time a sport was really about the student? It seems to be about the winning record or the championship or whatever, or the parents specifically. I've seen some horrible things at, teenage sporting events with parents. And even school becomes about the school board and the school system, and politics and youth ministry sometimes becomes about how big are we and what kind of program do we have and how can I show off to my youth pastor friends when I go to the next conference. And we subtly don't realize how we're communicating. And I don't think it's on purpose, but how we're communicating that these things we say are for you, they're really not for you, they're for us.
For sure. And
that's interesting.
That's what creates this subculture that's hidden, is that there's a lot of hurt and suspicion of the rest of the world. And that's why they've created these clusters of trying to survive and having their own unwritten and unspoken laws about how the world works. One thing that's different, I think, a lot of adults. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to pop in there, though, because I think we're talking about hidden worlds of teens as being the way you guys have been talking about is kind of a negative connotation. I don't know if you mean that way, but what I want to offer is that the process of becoming an adult requires establishing autonomy. Like, that's super important. If you never establish autonomy and you never break off from your family of origin to become your own family or become your own person, you are in for a world of trouble.
I really appreciate that clarification, because I don't think we're saying the subculture creating this, hidden world is a bad thing. It's more like it's a necessary thing. And I think there are more healthy ways to provide, like, adolescents, a coming of age ceremony, some sorts of steps to becoming adults that are more public and healthy and endorsed by the whole community, but leaving adolescents to fend for themselves and kind of just figure out life for themselves and abandoning them systemically, that's okay, I guess, if someone's already an adult and they have a sense of self and, they're able to deal with that kind of abandonment. But adolescents don't have the capability of performing like adults. So being there and not, like, letting them fend for themselves is a necessary part of bringing them into adulthood.
Can you say more about the abandonment thing? I don't quite follow. Like, for example, someone has a really loving structure of family and religious community or whatever. School, they're in a great school, they have good friends. Like, are they going to experience abandonment? And if they don't experience abandonment, are they going to have an adolescence?
Yeah, I think they'll still have an adolescence. I don't think that, like, I think abandonment is more like there is not, Jeff put it pretty well, there is not adult presence that is 100% for these adolescents primarily. There's adolescence is more busy than it's ever been, right? Like, just because they're driving everywhere, just because you as an adult are driving your kids to sports, just because you're paying for all the stuff that they're doing, that itself does not look like, is not the total of healthy support that they need. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but to what extent do your kids...
The idea of unstructured downtime with parents and children, or, like, school and kids, that kind of stuff doesn't really happen, I would say, for most teenagers in America. They don't have unstructured downtime where adults can be attentive to their needs outside of all of these things. Right?
Well, what if they don't want attention to their needs? I mean, they might be, like, rebelling against not. They might convey that.
Yeah, they may communicate that, but they really. I just want to point out there are a lot of psychologists and people that say it may seem like adolescents want to push against the boundaries all the time, which is true. It's a healthy, natural thing for adolescents to try to push against the boundary. We shouldn't see that as a bad thing. That's just what they do, becoming adults. But still, they actually appreciate, in all of these studies, adolescents appreciate healthy boundaries that are set by adults that are concerned for them. I think that shows up all the time.
Well, I think it's important to also remember, like, Mona, with what you're saying, is that everything happens in degrees of stuff. You know what I mean? Because it's not, you can have a loving support system with your family and your youth group or Boy Scouts or whatever you're involved in, but that there's a systemic aspect to it where not everyone's immune fully for it, but some people are experiencing it more than others. I mean, the same thing is true with, institutional racism. Like, depending upon where you live, you're going to be exposed more or less to that kind of isolation or whatever. And I think it's easy with stuff like this to fearmonger and use words that say, like, this is
Sure.
the rhetoric that's happening. Like, I remember I read these two books when I was a youth pastor. One was called Righteous, I think it was, something Sandler. And then the other one was called The Last Christian Generation by Josh McDowell. And essentially they were saying the very opposite things in a fearful way. So the Righteous one was all about how these youth groups are taking over adolescence and it's going to turn our country into, like, this, right-wing conservative whatever. And then there's Josh McDowell saying, this is the last Christian generation. We're not going to have any Christians left if we don't stand up for Christ and all this kind of stuff. And they're written, like, roughly around the same time. And there's just this whole, like, it's easy to take all these things and make a crisis from it, as opposed to recognizing there are degrees in which people are affected by this idea of adolescence. But I don't think we can deny that systemically within church and within general society is that it's easy to pinhole and put teenagers off to the side and feel like the best thing we can do is just have them being babysat instead of really develop who they are.
I think if you look at all of the signs, it is a crisis. I really do think so. I think we have an unhealthy societal structure for helping kids grow into adults. That's my opinion. And I think part of that is abandonment. That's not the only thing, but that's part of it.
I get what you guys are saying, that in the interview with Allison a couple weeks ago, for example, she talked about how people create side economies when they can't participate fully in
Exactly.
the main
Yeah.
economy. And in the same way, teens create side societies and they create side moralities and side codes. I mean, to the extent of like even forming gangs to protect themselves when
Absolutely.
they feel like the criminal justice system does not protect them. They're not safe in their neighborhood. So they have to band together and form basically militias.
But that
and other
happens
cultures.
even
Hold,
with
hold
like
on, hold on.
healthy students, though. That
Right.
like what
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
talking.
That's an extreme example, but I'm saying even with healthy students, like teens have to create their own cultures. So I get that. And I get that a lot of times is indicative of the mainstream failing them. But on the other hand, isn't it important that teens learn that the world does not revolve around them? I mean, we do live in a
Sure.
really self-absorbed culture these days. And I understand a lot of that's super positive, like very self-love based. But on the other hand, like what you said, Alan, like a few minutes ago about like adult figures or people or systems existing 100% for teens, I think that can be problematic too.
What do you mean?
Well, because I think everybody, doesn't matter how old you are, needs to understand the bigger picture that we are, it's not just about us.
Okay, absolutely. And so what I mean by that is when a structure exists for teens, part of that is going to be teaching them that it's not all about them. I don't mean to say like you're just
Okay.
going to coddle them. What I'm saying is, for me, some of the best leaders I've seen in any sort of adolescent world have a strong sense of leadership, and they communicate to students that it's not all about them. But still, what they're doing is about the students. Does that make sense? They're
Yeah.
still in their mind. They are geared toward actually helping the students live in the world. Okay, so this is part of the problem.
Form as healthy humans.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem is that adulthood has changed in the last 30 years.
How?
If I'm talking from a perspective of a person who has talked to a lot of parents, whether it's true or not, at least they feel incredibly busy and overburdened with things and do not have time for their students. They like every night of the week, they're going to something and doing something. They themselves have to work multiple jobs just to make it by because they don't have a living wage. They have to, do all of these events. And so when you ask like parents to do something, it's just one more thing in this huge like pyramid of cards that's going to come down. And that's what parent after parent has communicated to me. And like, maybe it's always been that way, but at least that's my experience. And when you have adolescents in that kind of an environment, it's hard. It's hard to pay attention to a student because adolescents are hard to deal with sometimes. They push our boundaries and our buttons and they're difficult and really not like it's easy not to address them or be with them because it's so time consuming and hard to do that for a lot of adults.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's the point I was trying to...
But I don't think so. I think it's a self-imposed. Like I don't think it's difficult because it's different for them. But
yes, exactly.
But that's not to mean that it is difficult. Like honestly,
you're right. It's not difficult to hang out with students. It's difficult at first because it's different. Adults don't understand what's going on with adolescents. That's part of the difficulty.
The parents in particular, like a lot of times the adolescents take out their frustrations and their rebellion, particularly against the parents, because that's how they're individuating. So, I mean, it makes sense that there's animosity in those relationships a lot of times. In fact, that's like psychologically expected from what I understand.
I think the biggest difficulty when it comes to adolescence is the lack of information that parents have. Because when it's a difficult transition for a lot of parents to transition from raising their child to raising their teenager or their pre-adult, because they go from I need to control your scenario to help keep you safe and guide you into now I need to slowly start letting go of those controls that I've established and to allow you to kind of run free. And parents don't do that. What tends to happen is, and this is a lot, is that parents will bring in more control as opposed to less and not let them make more mistakes and then create this atmosphere where a lot of times people feel more separated from everything that's happening. So I think if we're going to nail down one of the most important issues for me in adolescence is really training parents how to let go of control in a healthy way as opposed to create more ways to control.
I agree with that.
For me, what I look at is the socioeconomic changes, like even post 2008. So teens today, like a lot of their extracurricular funding has been cut, like for music and arts programs, for example, like programs that aren't specifically geared toward getting them scholarships to getting into college. And they can't get jobs because a lot of the jobs are taken by adults because our unemployment levels are higher than they've been for a long time. And, even like blue collar jobs that teens would typically be allowed to have post 16 years old. We've had thousands of factories shut down in this country in the last couple of decades. So when we look at teens today, like they're a lot of times bored. Like if they don't have a specialized skill like sports that will get them into college, college is so competitive and so expensive. The hopelessness I think we're sensing from a lot of teenagers, they can't get jobs, they don't have activities they're fulfilling a lot of times. And like you said, the ones that they do have are really always geared toward an ultimate goal, not toward developing them as people. Like the hopelessness that we're sensing is very real for this coming generation. Like we've handed them an economic debt crisis. We've handed them like a horrific international reputation for violence. We've handed, like if this is our future, we've not provided for them. And so it makes sense that like increasingly we're sensing frustration and angst. Even if those kids can't put a name to it, they sense that our country is not doing well. Like what is their role here with us?
Well, not only that, but culturally we've satirized them, like look at all the things that are out there about the millennials and how they're irresponsible and they just have their phones out all the time and all that kind of stuff, and they're just bored and they don't care about life. Well, the problem is we haven't given them something to really care about. We've just inserted them into this system and machine that really has no meaning or whatever, and of course they're going to act like that.
Yeah, and also like psychologists have been saying for decades that adolescents can't conceptualize abstract thinking because their brains aren't developed, but they're actually realizing that's wrong. Well, so how much of our psychological
mid to late adolescents can, but early adolescence and like junior high, they're just beginning to be able to be able to grasp some of that stuff. So asking like early adolescents to be able to grasp really big, non-concrete, like intangible objects, that's actually a part of the problem, in my opinion. Sometimes we expect not expect too much of adolescents, but we expect them to be at a place that they're not. We misunderstand what they're capable of. So we either ignore them or I see students break under their parents' pressure, honestly. You said something, Mona, about decriminalizing adolescence because sometimes it's criminalized itself. Like, I think that happens even in family units. Like, there's a failure to understand where their brain is at just a very basic level.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, Alan's important too, is we don't categorize. It's adolescence, period. We don't recognize the nuance of how you deal with someone early adolescence as opposed to mid and late adolescence.
Yeah,
and
very different.
How that change, and you need to guide through those different stages. And part of it is too, like culturally, we don't have it goes back to a little bit what you were talking about before, Alan, is we don't have any real rite of passage anymore. Like there's no kind of symbol or activity that teenagers can participate in that gives them this sense of I'm stepping into something new.
It used to be graduation from high school. It used to be graduation from high school and becoming 18 years old. You could point back in the day when adolescence was in its first bloom. You could say, you're 18 now, you're graduated, you're a part of adult society. We welcome you as a fully formed, fully responsible adult member of society. Where in the United States does that happen anymore? Like not even developmental psychologists. They no longer talk about 18 years old as you're now an adult. That's just not a reality anymore. They don't use that number. But back in the day, that actually was a very good picture of becoming an adult. So it's so much more fluid. We don't expect high school graduates to be adults, right? At least in the way that we portray them, like Jeff was talking about. And also in their own like cognitive development. They're not adults.
Well, I think the fact that we don't expect any kind of responsibility from teens and we don't give them the dignity and respect of treating them like full citizens of society, even though they can't vote or whatever, but they can still participate. Like we have to have some structures that tell them, yes, we respect you. We're glad you're here. We're thankful for your presence and we want you to contribute.
Yeah. Instead of being either ignored or treated like children. Cause that's not what needs to happen.
I want to tell a story about criminalization of youth. This is from a book that I highly recommend called Returning to the Teachings, Exploring Aboriginal Justice by Rupert Ross. And it's a guy who's worked with small Indigenous communities in Canada for many, many years. And he's a kind of a criminal justice activist. But he tells the story in the introduction of this book that just really kind of hit me between the eyes. Like I was blown away. So this whole book is about restorative instead of retributive justice. And I know we want to do an episode on that. So I'll just kind of throw this story out there because it's specifically about teenagers. But he arrived at this one community and he realized that out of the 400 people in the community, basically all of the teenagers 20 some odd teenagers who were present in the community spent almost every day by the water sniffing gasoline, which causes like incredible brain damage. Like it's very, very, very dangerous to do this. So he got them all together, some of the worst offenders, and he gave them a lecture, a 40-minute talk about how he knows an old man who did this for many years, and now he can't even put on his own clothes, and his family has to take care of him, and he's a burden on society. And the teenagers are kind of like acted kind of receptive to this information. But he said at the very end of this introduction, he says, at that time, I thought such an approach might make a difference to one or two of them. When I look back now, having learned that the escapist activities like sniffing are most often just symptoms of much deeper terrors engulfing entire communities, I marvel at my naivete. That's how he ends the introduction. So I want to offer that when we criminalize teens for behavior that we see as risky or melodramatic or violent or self-destructive, just like anybody who engages in those kinds of activities, that's not just a trademark of the teenage experience. It is indicative of deeper hurts that are happening that they don't have anywhere to deal with it. Because normal, healthy people don't self-destruct. You know, so he goes on to
you can say that 100 times and it still would be new to a lot of us. You know what I mean? Because self-destruction is, that's a part of our culture's ability to cope with.
So I mean, that's kind of the only, if you have no other avenue to cope with life, that's kind of what people either fall back into self-destruction or perfectionism, one or the other. And I think most teens you can classify in one of those two camps these days, you know? So anyway, he goes on to frame this whole book. I really recommend it. Like how these indigenous communities have replaced systems of punishment and incarceration with healing. Full on replace, not seeing those things in tandem, but replace. That if someone's doing something self-destructive and awful, even to the extent of like extreme sexual abuse, they've created methods of leading that person to healing and bringing them back from the brink of what he calls the seduction of crime and abuse. That bringing abusers back from the brink. So anyway, that's a really interesting.
Can I say one thing about that though?
Sure. Yeah.
I was a substitute teacher for 9 years, and I saw how adolescents, at least in schools, have changed, even at the same schools in the same towns. It is so hard to approach adolescence with an idea of restoration instead of punishment. I saw one school trying to do this. You know, when a student does something in the classroom that's disruptive, and, you know, normally they'd just be punished. They'd be sent out and they'd get a detention or whatever. They're trying to work with methods of like filling out a form and like actually talking with the teacher, arriving at, hey, why'd you do this? What was going on? Like actually empowering the student in those situations to figure out what they're doing. And for a lot of schools, like that is a very positive thing. And it's breaking this idea of like school to prison pipeline. But it's so hard. It's hard work for all the teachers. It's hard work for the school up front. And I think that's a good picture of what working with adolescents in a healthy way. It's hard up front. If you're a parent and you see your kids, you're going to give them more downtime or whatever because you've decided that's healthy for them. They may not or probably will not appreciate that, at least verbally outside initially. I think when we do healthy steps towards students, there's a lot of hard work up front, but it pays off in the long run. But those wide systemic changes, who has the energy for that in our society?
I would offer, if there's a giant ship making a courseway toward a direction, reorienting a couple sails is not going to help. It's probably going to just cause more confusion. So that school was probably doing great work, but like that school alone and those teachers alone cannot address all of that in themselves. Like it has to be a much bigger community effort to change the whole narrative of that kid's experience in this world. So it's probably not that those methods were wrong. It's just that they were ineffective because it's almost too late once the kids get to that stage.
Well,
unless there's like heavy intervention.
Like middle school and stuff like that is kind of what they're gearing toward because they have that opportunity. But still, it's really hard. You can ask teachers across California, at least. They're so burned out at how things have changed from the last 10 years. And it's really sad because that abandonment is going to reach a critical point because they're so taxed that there's just not the safety net that there even was for us when we were younger adolescents. That itself has changed. And I know it sounds like fear-mongering, but I was there. You know what I mean? I've been there for years, and I see it happen, and I talk to the teachers and all the students, and it worries me about the future of of adolescence in America.
I think with all of that, like, yes, these things are all true, and yes, there's some things that need to be moved forward, but there has to be, like, we're talking a lot about, well, how can we, give them agency as an individual and move forward into adulthood and give them responsibility and stuff like that. But we very rarely concentrate on letting them be an adolescent and have fun and enjoy that stage of their life, And I think that if we constantly frame the conversation amongst ourselves that this is a crisis and something needs to be changed, they're listening to that conversation.
That's true.
They're a part of that, and they're hearing that rhetoric, and that's going to further isolate them and make them feel hopeless. Like, I remember, in my context obviously is church, but this happened all over the place. But over and over again, the weight of the world was put on my shoulders as a teenager. Like, you are going to change the world for Jesus, or what if you died tomorrow? This whole, like, just all these weighty things put on me, and you need to step up and do this and do that. And I felt like any wrong move I made would ruin my life for as long as I went forward. And even in school, if you don't get good grades now, you're not going to get into the right college, and you're not going to have a good job. And it's like, oh my gosh, how can I, and so I rebelled because it was the only way that I could have fun. It was the only way that I could feel like I could escape from the weight. And I didn't do a very good job of it, which is why I got into youth ministry in the first place, was to help so other people wouldn't have to go through that stage. So I think that in the midst of this, we need to still provide places for them to be irresponsible in a way that's healthy, that provides that safety net that we have. Because if no one wants their whole lives ruined as a teenager because they make one mistake, and I'm not saying there aren't some mistakes that are worthy of that, but most are not, and we make them worthy of ruining their life.
Yeah. And I think also that when we were teenagers, the abilities and the availability for healthy rebellion was greater than it is today. And by that, I mean that the readiness of violently sexual imagery and media and entertainment and video games. And I know people rail against this a lot, but what we often don't talk about is cultures that celebrate those things and how they actually might reprogram developing brains.
Yes.
And like, there's a documentary project that's been going on in the UK where psychologists wanted to study the differences between violent porn addiction and not violent porn addiction when kids are in the teenage years. And the study was delayed because they couldn't find a big enough control group of students who were not addicted to violent pornography. We're talking not just like traditional pornography where someone may be exploited, but like erotically violent, stomach churning, disgusting pornography that is very, very, very easy to come by. It's not the old days where, some kid brings like a dirty Playboy into school. Like, we're talking like, 10-year-olds are watching Game of Thrones and media that's made for adult eyes, and that has horrifically violent themes. And so what I mean to say by that is that I think that I really appreciate a lot of celebrities that are taking on the challenge of saying, resist, like, find innocence again. Resist this easy thing because it's bad for you, not even for moral or religious reasons, but it's like actually bad for your health. And if parents actually knew the kinds of stuff that their precious children were consuming, like, we don't have a concept for how that could be because in our childhoods, that stuff wasn't around like it is now.
Yeah. But that conversation for me needs to be framed in the idea of health. Too often, it's framed in the idea of sin. I see that, honestly, I see it all the time in churches, where it's like, your teenagers are sinning. We need to stamp out sin. We do this. And instead of approaching it that way, like, we need to be able to validate, these human beings who are becoming sexual human beings and talk about sexuality in a positive way. But at the same time, like, really deal with all of those dangers as dangerous to the health of people. And I think that that's a good way to approach it, as opposed to what I've seen. I'd say 90% of the things about porn and even violent porn, it's just completely shaming to these teens who are trying to deal with sexuality. Although that does change. There are some people who are trying to change that. I think that needs to be framed that way, as opposed to the shaming, sinful kind of thing that kind of causes those problems in some cases.
When there's a cloud of shame around something, it goes underground. And what happens when it goes underground is it often festers and feels like it's wrong, even though it might be a response to a healthy curiosity. It might be kids exploring things their friends explore because they want acceptance and they want to be cool and they want love like we all do. Or it might be that they're working out themes of their own personal experience with sexual abuse as a kid because, like, I don't know, a huge percentage, I want to say 1 in 5 or 4 kids today experience sexual abuse before they hit teenage years, and they're just trying to figure it out or get their power back or something, and they don't know where else to go. So when you shame kids for healthy stuff like that, like, those are all healthy responses I would offer that you're not going to get anywhere with them, and you're probably going to make it worse.
And I think that balanced with all of that is, and I don't think it's talked about enough, is that how do you, as a parent or as an adult involved in the lives of these students, how do you monitor that activity, but also give some kind of space for privacy? Because privacy, I think, is a very overlooked and important part of adolescence, is some place where you feel like you have something that's your own, that you can choose to share or not share. And I don't think it's the idea that you can just keep things secret, but the idea of the ability to have a choice on what you want to keep secret and what you don't. And I think that's an important part of just lives in general. And I think privacy is an important part of developing into a person and knowing how to deal with things that are just yours and who to give them to and all that kind of stuff.
And I wish in that conversation, at the very least, don't prop up students with the illusion of privacy. Either like tell them they have this private moment or space, or they don't. It bothers me when parents go in and read the diaries and journals of their students without telling them, and then come to me and say, hey, my student read this, wrote this. They don't know I read that, but I want you to address it somehow. And it's like, I always tell parents, you are playing a dangerous game. The moment they find out you are giving them an illusion of privacy and tricking them, that trust is little in the first place just because of how adolescence is. But it's obliterated, and that kind of hurt they're going to carry, that they were told one thing. That's actually kind of sad. Our whole society is saying one thing and doing another, right? Our politics, our economics, our morality, our religion, kind of everything. Very few things are very consistent across all spectrums. But communicating to students one thing and doing another is a very powerful tool to teach them that adults and adult society is not trustable. I think that's part of the problem.
So first, okay, I guess 2 questions. First, how do we all forget this stuff? We've all been teens. Like, how do we forget as adults what it was like to be a teenager?
I think it's just because we are people, We first of all, our brains always color what things were like before. So the things if we made a mistake, then it was probably because as adolescents, an adult pointed out how horrible that mistake was. And as we've reflected in life, we've seen the consequences of that mistake because it was framed in such a negative way in the beginning that slowly over time we've replayed that. And then we don't, in all earnestness, don't want our kids, the teenagers we're involved with, to make those same mistakes, so that we paint it the same way that they do so that they can understand. And we forget that probably the best thing for us was if we were just given the space to live those things out instead of being told what was right and wrong constantly on a constant basis. And I think that it's just part of, and it's just part of that whole notion of, if you don't remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. We don't work through things anymore. So because we didn't work through it, we just revert back to how we were in that beginning, and we don't really move forward. And if we don't move forward from the things that we dealt with, and we don't try to deal with them and walk through them, then we're just going to impose that same thing on the next generation or whoever we're a part of.
I think for me, as far as how can we lose that positive sense of adolescence, of being refreshingly honest and open, I think it's because for me and for a lot of students I see, the perceived safety net of childhood, you look at your society, school, family, all this stuff in a normal situation, not in an abusive one, but you perceive this safety net and it's slowly taken out from under your feet. And by the time you're an adult, you're in a very scary free-for-all, everybody's greedy, everybody's going to cut you down kind of world.
Yeah. Well, and that leads me to my second question, which is, how do we foster a sense of trust and safety with teens?
Yes.
And I think we all remember these really formative experiences. Like, I remember the day my 8th grade teacher, who always told us the truth, like, we adored her because she's like, listen, this is the truth about the world. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Here it is. We just loved her for that. But I remember one day I had social skill issues as a kid. Like, really, I didn't have good social skills. And so instead of taking me aside and saying, hey, you're doing this, this, and this wrong, and that's alienating your friends, she said instead, you know what? You're a really good kid. I like you. But I noticed that you're having some trouble. And I just want to say, to have friends, you must show yourself friendly. And that was it. She just dropped this little nugget. And I thought about it so much because I respected her and I loved her already, and it really kind of changed my whole perspective on how I was presenting myself and how I was coming across to other people. Like just this one little thing that she told me. And she said it with an amount of respect and deference for who I was,
Yes.
So I think we all have those moments of like when we were really built up, and she probably doesn't remember that she had this interaction with me, but I will always remember it,
Because she had the time and the respect to engage you in a positive way. Like those moments are invaluable to students for sure.
Yeah, and they may never thank you for it. They may not realize that it's going to stick with them, but it does. And so, yeah, building that relationship of trust. Like I'm trying to think about
I know what it's not. Happens. I know what it's not. And this is my big crusade. Oh, sorry, that's a bad word. This is my big war. That's
a better word.
Right. I think all adults everywhere should commit to not allowing other adults to belittle or ridicule adolescents, to discourage them, to neglect them, and speak poorly into their lives. Because I see it happen in public, in private, all around me. And it's so uncomfortable to address it because we almost expect it. I'll give you an example. In our small mountain town, every single year, a football coach would hold a dinner. You'd invite all the family and friends of every single one of the football players. And what they would do is they would line up all of the seniors and they would take them one by one. And the coach would put his hand on the shoulder of this 17-year-old and he'd speak into the microphone and he would talk just about that individual kid, maybe for the first time since he's ever been, in his 4-year football career. And so all of his family's there, parents and cousins, and the coach would say whatever came to mind. Did not prepare. He would just speak off the cuff. And I can't tell you how many times I watched kids beaming because they were so proud and they finally had their moment in the spotlight just to get honestly embarrassed and torn down by this football coach in front of a crowd and a group of adult human beings who wouldn't stand up and say, "Hey, jackass, that's not appropriate to say." You know what I mean? Like nobody protected these adolescents from public embarrassment at the hands of a football coach. So when I got up, I actually got off super scot-free, super easy. I went up and the coach said, Alan had a lot of potential when he was a junior in high school, but he actually quit halfway through the season. He joined back as a senior, he did pretty good. His brother is going to, this university on a full ride football scholarship, and his little brother's coming up and he has a lot of promise. But yeah, Alan had potential. And then that was it. That's all he said about me. And honestly, it didn't bother me because he didn't talk about me that much. And that's totally fine. But you should have heard some of the stuff that I heard about students that he did say, that when he did talk about them, were just negative in front of a whole group of people. And I see that in, churches and kind of everywhere. Students
but teasing can be a form of love, though, right? Like,
yes, but there's a difference between teasing and embarrassing. I teased and I saw Jeff tease students all the time. That's definitely a part of love. But I'm talking about hanging them out to dry in front of the rest of society. I think that part of our responsibility as adults is not to just seriously ridicule students, because for some of them, that is a very, very powerful mark against them as a human being. They don't quite have the sense of self to brush that off that we do. They're much more vulnerable than they look on the outside. So they may brush it off or whatever, but that could impact them for the rest of their lives.
Wow. How cowardly is it to pick on somebody that much less powerful than you?
Not cowardly, normal. It's a societal norm that I've seen across all sorts of situations.
It can be cowardly if it's normal.
Yeah. It's cowardly, but I just think people don't think about it. It's almost an automatic reaction to be able. Jeff said earlier, we satirize the younger generation. We make them a satire and kind of make fun of them, but that happens even on an individual level, and everybody's comfortable with it because they're kids, because they're adolescents, And again, I'm not talking about teasing. I'm talking about actual ridicule. And if every parent and coach and teacher and youth pastor around the United States was like, you know what, we are going to oppose public ridicule of students, I think that would be like one huge step, not a small one, but a huge step in the right direction.
Well, I mean, where do kids learn bullying from? From the rhetoric of adults, right?
Exactly.
They learn what they're modeled.
They do.
I think the defining between ridiculing and teasing is how much do you know that student and how much do you know what really is something that you can tease them about, and that takes time to develop. And I think adults get to the assumption that because I'm an adult, I deserve respect, as opposed to they feel they need, and this happens with parents all the time too, is that they do need to earn the respect of their child, of that adolescent.
Well said.
But I would have parents come to me all the time and be like, I don't understand why they won't tell me what's going on in their life. And I said, well, do they ever ask you or try to tell you about the TV show they watched or the music that they like or the video game that they're playing? And they're like, yeah, but I don't want to hear that. It doesn't matter. It's stupid. I want to know what's going on in their life. And I said, you're not taking the time to find a common interest. And who knows, you may even find that you like that TV show or that music or whatever. But if you're not willing to engage in the things that they're interested in, even just for I hate musicals, but I went to so many musicals as a youth pastor and I loved every second of it because someone I knew and someone I respected and someone I loved and someone I was a part of their life was in it, and I loved all of it because they were a part of it and it was something they were interested in. And that's why I would go and be a part of it, and not just go begrudgingly, but go because I loved that person. And I don't think that we take the time to recognize that we need to earn that respect, and sometimes try to learn something new and be interested in something that we may on the surface think is stupid.
Man, if my parent can't listen for 2 seconds about a video game I like, and I can't trust them with that desire of mine, how can I trust them when it really matters? And I know there's shame surrounding it. Yeah.
So I'm hearing everything not to do, but I want to frame it in the positive light. So I was kind of taking notes while you guys were talking. Well,
no positivity.
So what I heard was consistency, honesty. Consistency and honesty probably go really closely together. Like being a consistent person. Being honest with your teen or whoever you're working with, setting firm boundaries, but staying consistent with those boundaries, but also having a healthy curiosity for them.
Yes.
Wanting to engage with them, wanting to be present with them, spending time with them.
Absolutely.
Even if they rail against you for a while, they'll come around. And as you build that trust and relationship, is a long process. And most of all, celebrating their existence and respecting them. I think you'll get more in return for those kinds of approaches. Absolutely. That's what I heard from everything you guys just said.
What a good place to start. Short of fixing the economy and all of our societal problems, I think I think that's huge. And that's going to make all the difference when adults can embrace that.
Well, I think that's as good of a place as any to kind of wrap up this conversation. So let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to the conversation this week, you can comment on the show notes at irenicast.com/38. And there you'll find some informational links about some of the things that we've talked about. So we're going to kind of continue this conversation on the other side of the music by each of us giving our top 3 fictional adolescent characters. This will be our first top 3 segment. Maybe we'll do this another time with a different category, but we will be choosing.
And then we can talk about our top 3s.
Oh, very good. I like that. Planning for the future here. So we're going to do top 3 adolescent characters. So I think the best way to do this is we'll both start with 3, and then we'll rotate, and then we'll go 2, and then we'll go 1 each. That way we can kind of mix it up a little bit. All right. So Alan, let's start with you. What's your number 3?
Number 3 would be Max from Goofy movie. You ever see the Goofy?
Oh, that's such a good movie.
Yeah, it starts out Max. It's an animated cartoon where Goofy has this kid he's having a hard time relating with, and he's got this epic skateboarding scene at the beginning, talking about what he's going to do with his summer, and he's hopping over people's back fences, and there's this girl he likes at school, and blah blah blah. And the storyline is he's going to go to this huge rock concert, and it's going to be amazing. But his dad takes him on a fishing trip instead. And so he basically learns through a series of adventures and mishaps that his dad is someone that he can love and appreciate.
Aw. Mona, how about you?
So my number 3 spot has to go to Elena from the Vampire Diaries. You guys, the show. I've seen all 6 seasons. I'm not embarrassed to say that it's very good. And it's funny that they make fun of Twilight and other vampire flicks in the show, which I appreciate. It was originally recommended to me from a friend of mine who's a big art house film person and was like, no, this show's really good. So I appreciate the acting. She is a teenage girl who is kind of falls into this cosmic chain of events where 2 vampire brothers fall in love with her and craziness ensues. But it's very angsty, dealing with the mortality, kind of existential issues. So, and I appreciate that she never loses her sense of self through all that happens to her.
What about you, Jeff?
My number 3 is a recent addition to the pantheon of fictional characters, Adam Goldberg from the Goldbergs.
So good.
This season in particular, Adam Goldberg has entered into puberty and adolescence, and
no, I haven't seen that yet. I haven't caught up.
It is brilliant.
I don't know about this show. What's it about?
It's about a family in the 80s. It's narrated by Patton Oswalt, which automatically makes it awesome. And it's just this random family going through life, and just a family sitcom. But it's on ABC. It's really funny.
So
it's
good.
really
It's
good.
very funny.
It's based
is it like
off
New Boy Meets World.
Kind of. It's based off the creator, whose name is Adam Goldberg, and basically he's basing the whole show on his family. And at the end of every episode is based on a situation they had in his family, and he always had a video camera when he was a kid. So at the end of every episode, they show real family footage from that event that inspired that episode.
No way.
It's
He's
great.
a really nerdy. I guess he was a really nerdy kid, and he always carried a camera around. So that's what it's based on. That's what the character does in the show.
And the character's really hitting his stride in adolescence this season, and I also relate, not just because of the things that are going on in his life, but also the context is the 80s, early 90s.
Yep.
So
there's 8-bit music introducing, and yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's great. That's my number 3. Adam or Alan, how about your?
Hey, he said he slipped because sometimes Adam acts like me. I'm not gonna lie. Okay, my number 2 is Leo Biederman from Deep Impact. You haven't seen Deep Impact?
Is that the main kid?
What?
The main kid?
The main kid. Yeah, he's just this humble kid. Isn't
it about
this humble adolescent
or something?
No. So it's just this humble adolescent who's in his astronomy club, and he discovers a comet that's on collision course with Earth. So,
jeez, Alan, far your picks are so far out of reality. A cartoon and the end of the world comet.
We didn't have to say this was realistic.
For adolescents, everything's the end of the world. Okay, I'll just leave that there. So here, he discovers this comet, and he actually uses... I have to ruin the plot for it to sound cool.
I think spoilers are appropriate for a movie from the late 90s.
Spoilers for Deep Impact. He has this girlfriend, and he becomes an instant overnight celebrity because he discovered this comet, and it's all these disasters are happening, and they're trying to figure out who's going to be allowed to go into this vault to live past this huge impact, because the whole world's going to die, right?
Only one person?
No. A society of intellectuals and scientists and farmers and blah, 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 blah.
You raise humans.
So they give Leo Biederman a spot because he's a celebrity, but he can only take his immediate family, and they've already got separated and all this other stuff. So he has to marry his girlfriend to save her. And what adolescent boy doesn't want to save his girlfriend by marrying her and using his celebrity after he discovered the whole world's going to die?
Isn't that basically what you did with your life?
Yeah, that's my story. So I tell myself. It's amazing. I love that movie.
All right, Mona, what's your number 2?
Hey, someone said guilty pleasure before, and I took that to heart. So
I did, yeah. So I'm about to say my guilty pleasure. Okay, when this movie came out, I flipped a lid. So this will display my age a little bit. But you guys remember the movie The Little Giants?
Yeah, I love that movie.
Friggin' Icebox. I wanted to be Icebox. She was so cool. She's a football playing badass girl who and so I don't know if it counts as adolescence, but she might be prepubescent, but I think that's the most angsty time of adolescence, so I think it totally counts.
It's pretty close.
And she has to balance being a bro or being a sexually viable cheerleading option. Yeah. And she chooses to, again, this is I guess the theme for me today, be true to herself and kick some football ass and throw the pom-poms away. So I appreciated that.
I'm going to watch that movie again. All right, Jeff.
That's a great movie.
Number 2.
My number 2 is Gary and Wyatt from Weird Science.
Oh, don't they make a girl in their lab?
Yes.
That's kind of weird.
And then they learn the valuable lesson of treating a woman with respect.
Cannot construct a female.
Exactly. I love that movie when I was a kid. So, and I could relate with the awkward maneuvering through your sexual desires as an adolescent.
That's awesome. All right. Do we do a drum roll for number 1 or just go into
ready? Drum roll, ready?
Very nice.
That was great.
Number 1 for me of all time, Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Oh,
I believe Cameron. That. When I think Cameron, I think you, Alan.
You think of me?
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
There has never been a movie that I've watched where I've connected on a deep psychological level as I have with Cameron. Especially the part where he's looking at the painting and it goes closer to the pointillism and then it goes back to his face and then closer. It was that moment for me where I like mind melded with this character. It's pretty amazing.
On my honorable mentions, I had Ferris Bueller.
That's a great one.
Yeah, Ferris Bueller I could take or leave, but his friend Cameron, that's gold. That guy's awesome.
I identify with Ferris Bueller. Maybe it does say something about your person, who you identify with in that particular movie.
It does.
Okay, number 1. Are we ready for mine? Drum roll for myself. You guys, Daria.
Oh, that's a good one.
Daria is the best teen character ever written, in my humble opinion.
I don't know what you're talking about.
She's a side character from Beavis and Butthead that eventually got her own show.
She's this very...
I wasn't allowed to watch that when I was a teenager.
Well, I didn't know about the Beavis and Butthead thing, actually, but she's just this... She is... If you look up adolescent angst in the dictionary, like depressive adolescent angst, who's like super cynical and just trying to exist in the world and has like very snarky friends and actually a really philosophical concept of how things work, like Daria is your show.
The personification of Generation X, grunge, like anti-establishment teenager, really smart.
Awesome.
It was a good one. That's a great one.
Daria. It's still a good show. Yeah.
So Cameron and Daria would totally hang out and connect.
Daria would probably make fun of Cameron and Cameron would get his feelings hurt.
Yeah.
He'd be too depressed to care, though. That's the best part.
Then they'd steal his father's car.
All right, my number 1 is somewhat hypocritical in the sense that it is a satirical version of teenagers, but it's the squeaky voiced teenager from The Simpsons, Jeremy Friedman.
Doesn't he work at like a fast food
Works
place?
at Krusty Burgers. Always has the high squeaky voice. To me, like when I think teenager, that's the first thing I think is that voice and that face and everything about it. It encompasses all of the difficulty of being a teenager in that one character, which I like. So that's my number 1. I had a lot of honorable mentions. I know you two had a difficult time coming up with 3, and I had a difficult time narrowing it down to 3.
What were your honorable mentions?
Squints from Sandlot.
Oh, yes. That's such a good one. Who else?
Those are kids, though. That's a kid.
But that's an adolescent act that he did at the pool. Like that is...
I guess that is kind of a coming of age kind of
exactly.
Thing. It is.
Which is why it was honorable mentions. It didn't make the list because of that
My family
reason.
watches that movie every 4th of July.
As well they should.
I love that movie.
My other one was Dexter, Keenan's character from Good Burger.
Very cool.
Trying to figure out responsibility and all that kind of stuff. Great movie. And then my last one is a little silly, but it's Clark Kent from Smallville.
Have we not been being silly? That's like the least silly option that we've heard so far.
Well,
that's a good show.
The one that, like, especially the earlier seasons, because that's when he was actually in Adolescence. But when I love the one episode, he discovered his heat vision while he also discovered like going through puberty. So every time he got turned on, his heat vision would go off, and he like burned something in class. And I just thought that's a great image of how it feels inside.
That is a great image of how it feels for adolescence. That's funny.
I don't really remember anything about the plot. I just watched the show to look at that actor.
Oh yeah, Tom Welling.
He's so pretty. Hey, if you listen to our podcast, what's his name?
Tom Welling.
Tom Welling. Hey, if you're listening, if you're a fan of our 10,000 downloads, if that's one of you, then please write the show. I'd love to meet you. All right, let's wrap up the show.
Yeah, I think that'll do it for us this week.
Stupid things.
Talking about adolescent angst. Oh yeah.
Crushes.
Thank you. Oh, that should have been our top 3. Top 3 adolescent celebrity crushes.
No.
That would have been a good one.
JT.
No.
Hey, JT, if you're listening to our show.
The girl from Walk to Remember was one of my crushes.
Oh, but she was like terminally ill. Does that do it for you, Alan? Don't put that
Oh my god.
That is amazing. That is so great. Well, on that note, that will do it for us this week. Thank you so much for joining us. If you like what you hear, you can help support the show by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. Your ratings and reviews really help out the show by making it easier for people to find us, and contact us anytime at our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback, and there you'll find all the ways you can contact us. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.